Let's go out, we'll take no prisoners.
Hello, my name is Avi Federgreen, and welcome to another edition of Unleashed, a guide to indie filmmaking. My name is Avi Federgreen, and today is episode 107 with our guest from Los Angeles, California. Well, not really Los Angeles, but outside of Los Angeles. My good friend, sort of family member, distributor extraordinaire, Michael Repsch of Dark Star Pictures. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks, Avi. How's it going, everyone?
Really great. Thanks for joining us, Michael. I mean, this is episode 7, and we've talked a little bit in some previous episodes about distribution and about the world of cinema as it is now, as far as audience attraction and things like that. But we've never really gotten into it like I hope we can get into today. So you've been in the business for quite some time. I'd love for you to just sort of backtrack a little bit and start how you got into the business. What was it about the business that attracted you to get into the business, and the trajectory that got you into starting Dark Star Pictures?
Sure. I mean, what's more glamorous than the distribution business? No, coming out of university, I'm a graduate of the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, and I chose a different direction than my contemporaries. Most people go to Wall Street and hedge funds and into the financial sector, and I chose the film world. Coming out of a business school, it was an unpopular decision, is what I would say. Our job fairs were filled with people from, Wall Street and, all the financial companies, not really film companies. Those that did come, were the big guys, the studios, which I really had very, very little interest, in working for. My love for film is something that goes back to when I was a young boy. So I really wanted to work, in the business side. I had the pleasure of going to the Cannes Film Festival while I was still in university, which was really eye-opening. It was something where I'd been to film festivals before, but I had never been to a market. And the Cannes Film Festival had a market, which was all the people who I wanted to connect with, because I'm not a filmmaker. I'm not a creative. I'm a creative business person. So it was really interesting to see a market where like-minded people were buying and selling films, and, kind of the inner workings of how an independent film in particular, foreign films and genre films, which I personally very much like, how those find life, how those get out there when they're not backed by a studio. So it was really eye-opening to see the marketplace, in Cannes. So I knew, going back in for my final year of college, I knew that I didn't want to be working with a studio. I wanted to be with one of these indie companies. Problem was getting in the door. It's a smaller industry than people realize, So I was very fortunate, in Philadelphia, where I'm from, despite being in sunny LA now. I was very fortunate to be able to connect with one of the, two local independent distribution companies in Philadelphia, Breaking Glass Pictures, and really get in and get exactly what I wanted, which was a large sphere of influence, in terms of a loose leash to do, lots of different things, see different things, in the inner workings of the business, and really give me more control on my career than a studio, job would have been,
Mhm.
working for someone, getting coffee, whatever. So with Breaking Glass, it was also the kind of the beginnings of the digital business. So a company that had gone really from a physical media company into, this new digital world while I was getting into the business 15 years ago. That was really exciting, so I was kind of spearheading that transition into digital. Even if I didn't know that's what I was doing, that's just where the business was going, and I was riding that wave. So, I got involved in every aspect of finding the digital platforms, and really discussing with people, again, who are like-minded, people who are similarly aged, in terms of who was making decisions in some of these streaming platforms, and really getting in early to talk with them and develop relationships. Fast forward to today, I started Dark Star 7 years ago now, which time flies,
Mm,
especially with COVID time. Feels like a lot of compressed years in there. But I decided to go out on my own and start Dark Star with the experience that I was able to get with from Breaking Glass, and just kind of knowing the workings of the business so firmly. It was time for me to go out on my own, to make my own decisions on content, and really to kind of fill what I thought was a little bit of a gap in the industry, which is someone who's kind of focused on certain areas of filmmaking and content skew, but also a filmmaker friendly hub, a place where artists could be seen, if you will, and have discussions, good and bad, with what's happening in the business, and
right.
transparency into what's out there and what life is. And my kind of bigger picture goal has always been to help with those who are creating film, film that has always impacted me personally, to give more insights and understanding, so that when people are making those movies and making those creative decisions, that they're going into that, with knowledge of, how to monetize it, and where you can actually find an audience, for your films, and kind of what you should be doing, at least have some idea of it,
Right.
so that's kind of where Dark Star was birthed.
Um, so flying back all those years, and then now here we are today. What do you feel like is the difference in the business, in distribution, um, and in the kind of films that you're seeing versus what you were seeing in the 7 years ago when you first started Dark Star?
Sure, sure. How dirty do you want me to get here?
I would
Because
love for you to be as dirty and transparent as possible.
well, it's called Unleashed, huh?
That's
So
right.
the going back even further before Dark Star,
Yeah.
the thing was when it was early on in the digital business, there was it was kind of a gold rush. There was a wealth of platforms who were starting, who needed content,
Right.
and wanted to work with different content SKUs. So when I first started working with someone like Netflix, we would sell in 75% of Breaking Glass's slate into Netflix. Even when I started Dark Star, 7 years ago, we would sell, a good amount of films into places like Netflix and Hulu, these quote bigger streamers, who were, had what seemed to be infinite cash, or publicly traded or owned by gigantic corporations,
Right.
the deepest pockets possible. We were selling a lot of content to them because they got to feed the beast. But what we quickly learned, and well, I guess maybe not so quickly, but at least what we know now and over the last few years, is that what these companies were doing, they were buying our content so that they could take data sets on the content to make their own. So they stepped on the back of the independent filmmakers and distribution companies to get
Mhm.
data so that they could go out and do it themselves and then turn their backs on us. It's not to say we do not do business with these companies anymore. We just do far less. But what happens is, when one door closes, another opens, and the advent of ad-based VOD, many more platforms going out and becoming available, and also just consumers understanding the different places where they can find content, has really graduated from where it was 7 years ago. So
Right.
now, we see this huge pivot from what used to be guaranteed, well, at least as guaranteed as you could be, money coming in from a streaming partner, to going into, now we're going on to these ad-based, platforms, places like Tubi and Roku channel and YouTube, who are great partners. And we're finding our audience similar to how we would find them, when we put something in theaters, or
Right.
on transactional VOD when someone rents it. So we now have just a different way of monetizing content, which is harder, more
Right.
competitive, more difficult, and less guaranteed. but also has a glass ceiling in terms of, how we can go. So, so when the whole business has changed in terms of how we can make money, we have to start to change how we look at films and what films, actually work in this space. And fortunately for us, we tend to focus on, and we kind of always have focused on films that are in targeted lanes, audience lanes. So we have, always worked with genre films. And over the last 5 years, we've really focused in on LGBTQ plus content, content that has, defined audiences in both cases,
Right.
who we can market to at a more impactful dollar, and who are very hungry for different kinds of content, that's not caste dependent or even language dependent. We can still release foreign language films.
Right.
So, it's an ever evolving business, like any businesses, I suppose. But we really have to more than ever adapt seemingly monthly to what's changing, in the business to stay viable, and stay, relevant.
Yeah, I mean, like in digital, and jump in anytime, Mike. But it used to be in the early days where Apple was the king of making money off of, and Amazon in the early days when they would go to festivals and they would offer the distributors a big deal to get, to give them a title, and the distributors were running around like mads trying to sign deals with Amazon at TIFF, for example, and some of the other markets. Obviously, that's all changed now, and the number one performing platform is Tubi, right?
Correct. Yes. Which is interesting. I mean, these gargantuan, companies like, Apple, Amazon, they've really shifted what they do. I mean, Apple, when we started working with Apple and Apple started in the movie side of things, they were solely a means to an end, from a distribution standpoint. They're a platform where people could come and rent and watch our movies and buy them. Now they make their own movies.
Right.
They make, and they spend lots of money on it. And they make good stuff too.
Mm.
They've shifted their focus away from, and most of their staff away from, this focus on transactional VOD, where we used to make so much money. Similarly, Amazon, the Amazon, who was a platform, who still is a platform where you can rent a movie, you can buy a movie, you can stream a movie with ads or without ads,
Mhm.
which, on a surface level appears to be great opportunity for distribution.
Mhm.
However, what the payment structures are with them, and how we can actually monetize that, it tells a different story. I
Right.
mean, when a company like that is spending hundreds of millions of dollars, on their own content, on the MGM library, they quickly do not care about what an independent film does on their platform. Or if we even do $10 million a year with Amazon, that is nothing to them. So they quickly lose interest in us and focus on how they want to monetize their own content. And that's kind of what I mean overall. It's a little bit different than the situation with some of the streamers, but it's a similar story. People, they lose interest in the support that we used to have is gone. Whereas, places like Tubi, which is also owned by Fox, that's a place where, it benefits everyone, to have things perform there, because their business is tied to selling to advertisers and as many ads as possible. It's quite, secular, right? I mean, we're going back to, the days of the old broadcast days of selling ads. When people didn't want to watch ads and they cut the cable, now, they transition to streaming services and SVOD services with nothing. Those are starting to cost too much because you can't have every one of them. So what are you doing? You're going to services like Tubi and,
Yeah.
consuming again, which is really just, a la carte cable. It's
Yeah.
not linear programming, but
Right.
you're consuming it the same way as you used to in the 90s, when you watched, films on any broadcast network. So, it changes, but it also kind of comes back to what it used to be in some level. So, but that's kind of I think it's important that filmmakers, who are listening to this, who are, trying to find their way, they understand, what you need, and what this looks like, because, unfortunately, sometimes we see some really great films and we just can't make them work because they won't work on an ad-based platform. If someone turns it off, you can't make any money because no ads run. So there's a lot that goes into it that I don't think people, making the content are considering at this time. I hope they are more so, and I hope people will listen to this and,
I'm
do that.
interested I want to continue on this talk conversation about this, because I've never really thought about, as a filmmaker, how a film would work on an AVOD platform. And
Yeah.
and you mentioned that. I'm interested to know, what do you mean by that?
Yeah, so I mean, it's about maintaining, the viewers' attention,
Right.
right?
Okay.
Keeping them intrigued. I mean, if in a lot of ways, instead of looking at a film as a three-act,
Hmm.
process, you should be looking at it as an 8 to 10 act, or almost like an episodic, right?
Right.
Because it's going to be broken up by these ad breaks, and people's attention spans are shorter than ever.
Right.
That's a
Right.
I'm no scientist or,
Right.
or a doctor, but
Right.
this is true,
Right.
and there's, you have 19 screens, whether it's your phone, your iPad, your computer, and your TV, all in the same room.
Right.
So, you when you're structuring content historically, it's a three-act, process that you're putting together. And I'm encouraging filmmakers to look at it much more along the lines of an episodic piece, because, about every 30 minutes ish, sometimes more like 18 minutes in a film, they're going to be breaking it up on ad platforms, and you need to get people to the next ad break and through that ad break and wanting them to come back,
Right.
because there's such a glut of content.
Right.
If you're boring up into an ad break, they'll turn it. There's a likelihood that a consumer will turn it off.
Right.
If you turn it off, you're kind of screwed. So, I think it's important that you are, whether that's building suspense, build, just cliffhangers again, going back on that, or, if you're a horror film, just lots of action. These are things that, you should be considering, how you structure them in your piece of content. Gone are the days of the slow burn. The
Right.
slow burn is one of the most
Yeah.
difficult things in the
Mm.
AVOD world.
Yeah. And the thing is, what's interesting is every single AVOD platform is going to have ad breaks in different places than the other AVOD platform.
Right.
So it's not like you can, as a filmmaker, plan on where those ad breaks are going to be. You just have to make sure that your foot is on the pedal and that you're creating a film that, as the film progresses, you become more and more drawn into the film, so that you never want to click the button to get out of the film. You are
Yeah.
held on till the end.
Yeah, that's a extremely valid point, because a lot of times, filmmakers believe that we do have control of where the ads go, but contractually we literally do not.
Right.
These platforms get to dictate it, and honestly, the more ads, the better.
Right.
But you need to be, cognizant of what you're driving. I think more than anything, and again, especially in the genre world, I think things like sound design, become so extremely important. They've always been important,
Right.
but you think about sound design in the theatrical space, and I
Mhm.
mean in a 2.0, home viewing space, things like sound, are a way that you can really tap into a viewer's psyche, and you can
Right.
keep them interested, with that. And this is really only for genre and thriller type films, where you can build suspense through, a score, or your sounds that you're throwing at,
Right.
someone. And I think that's a really good way, to keep people interested and, creeped out by something, and, wanting to see more. That's a good way to kind of think about it. But you need to be your foot on the pedal,
Right.
100%.
Right.
Like you said, I mean,
I mean, one of the things that's interesting for me to ask you is, so you're a film lover, obviously, and you're also a distributor. So you watch a film, you love it, but I mean, obviously, we think as distributors that watching a film, we think once we've finished watching it, oh my God, this could be a hit. We could make a lot of money on that. And, you and I are involved in a couple of titles that we're distributing together, and you help me release my films in the US and so on. And I help you to some extent in Canada. And how do you separate yourself as a film lover and a film distributor when you're watching a film? Because for me, I love film. I do. And I look at a film and I go, God, I wish I made that movie. You know what I mean? But sometimes your heart works more than your head when it comes to picking up a film, because just because you love it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to generate revenue from it, right?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that's probably one of the hardest things I've had to deal with in my career. Especially when it was less of a problem when I didn't have my own company, is what I'll say.
Yeah.
But when I started, Dark Star, and now I'm the sole voice in, my acquisitions, right? Not at this point in time, because I have a team, and we work together with people like you and whoever else. But when I started, it was just me,
Mm-hmm.
and it was really difficult because I made some missteps, some things that I thought were just brilliant films from Mike the film lover and not Mike the distributor,
Right.
and separating, like you said, heart from head is one of the most important things ever. I had to come to real, terms with some films I just enjoyed watching. And
Right.
I can't, and I can't necessarily add value to them. So I always look at, because it's a disservice to the filmmaker as well.
Mm.
We don't want to work on things that we cannot, really excel with and make money for everyone on. So, I have to look now at things and I say, can I add value to this through
Right.
what I know about the business
Right.
and what relationships we have with the platforms and where we're going, and then also, like, what level of marketing we can realistically put behind this, because the difference of Dark Star coming in on a film and A24, A24 has Guggenheim money. They have, very, very deep pockets, and they can support their films much further from a dollar level than we can,
Right.
so that means they might be able to take a film, that is slower or harder, and they can just put more dollars behind it and give it a better shot. We
Right.
can't do that. So we have to look at what our situation is, how we can add value, and if it behooves us from a relationship standpoint in our platform partners, what we can do with it. I got to tell you, there's also a lot of times when I watch a movie and I don't, it's not my favorite movie in the world, but I see opportunity in it, it does not make it a good film because I don't like it personally, or I don't, it's not my favorite of what I've
Right.
watched. But if there is opportunity and I can add value, I feel that there's a service. We're providing a service to artists,
Right.
and who am I to turn away, that for them? So, it's a careful balance, and it's never perfect, and it never will be perfect.
Right. And what's interesting also is, and I know that you're a supporter as far as a sponsor for a number of film festivals like Fantastic Fest, and in Cannes you promote the Genre Pavilion, um, the Fantastic Pavilion, and so on and so forth. I guess what's interesting to me is so many great indie movies that do really, really well in the genre. Let's use genre films for as a linchpin here. Do really well in the genre festival circuit, but when it comes time to putting it out there in distro, they don't always win.
Yeah,
And it's interesting because the genre audience is the most rabid audience there is of movie lovers. Like they just are. They can't get enough.
certainly the
They
most pronounced.
for sure, but intelligent. Like they know what they like, they know what they don't like. There's no in between. And if they really love it, they'll sit around with their buddies and talk about it for hours on end. I mean, I remember I went to Fright Fest in the UK and with Life Changer, and the movie ended, and everybody was spilled out into Piccadilly Square, and they talked about the film for whatever seemed like an eternity, and then I've been to other genre festivals and it's kind of the same thing. Yet when they come out in distribution, they shit the bed.
Yeah, I mean, there's a line of saturation that can be had, you know.
Yeah.
I mean, because we look at the genre audience in particular, and you're right, that's a very hungry, open-minded, conversation-based audience, but it's still a niche audience, I mean, it's still a small subset of the general population.
Right.
And at what point, are we oversaturating that in the festival world? There are more film festivals than there are days of the year,
Yeah.
across the world.
Yeah.
There are heavy, the heaviest kind of genre focused festival are, the genre festivals, the fantastic festivals, the
Right.
fantasy festivals.
Right.
These are the most, there's probably the most of them of anything else, in terms of like a target piece content area.
Right.
You can oversaturate that way. You still need to be able to use that audience as a foundation and cross over into the quote mainstream at a certain level. You look at things like, so, for example, Terrifier,
Right.
which, everyone wants to make the next Terrifier. They
Right.
don't realize that the first Terrifier didn't do as well.
Yeah.
Terrifier 2. So Terrifier 2, was so for the genre audience. I mean, that film is it would be it's NC-17, if it's rated, back in the day would have been X, rated. And it's a film that's so graphic, that, it's so genre oriented because of this graphic nature. But that same graphic horror content, it was jet fuel for that movie, to
Right.
set it to the next level because social media, right? So the genre audience set it up and they're talking about it and they're, everything like that, like we do with all the genre films. But then it gets to the high school aged kids on TikTok,
Yeah.
who are making TikTok videos about it,
Yeah.
spider webs out, and suddenly it explodes. So, this is an example of something that is purely for the genre audience in a historical sense
Right.
that breaks out into the mainstream because it goes viral. That's it. I mean, there's nothing else really to
Yeah, I
that.
mean, Skinamarink is another example of a film made in Canada, Alberta, by some friends of mine that, they got into a number of genre festivals and then it got leaked in Latin America. Uh, AMC, RLJ, etc. had the US rights. And when it blew up on the internet, they released the film in the United States theatrically and made over $2 million worth of box office.
Right.
The director is now directing a film for A24.
And look, it's no different than when we look back at the Blair Witch Project or
Right.
Paranormal Activity. This
Right.
is the same thing, just a different means. In terms of how it went out there, right? It's I would actually argue that the Blair Witch in particular was smarter marketing and not lightning striking. But I
Right.
but I do think at some level it is luck. You get a little bit of luck, that goes into this, So, the genre audience, is great and they can be a great propellant, for something to push it up, and talk about it. And word of mouth is good. But, I think more than ever, and this is coming from somebody who does not use any of these services, social media is so important, and I think filmmakers, and producers should be thinking about, what's your social media plan,
Right.
to get out there. And I'm not talking about going out and spending money. I'm talking
Yeah.
about being smart and clever with, how you're attacking an audience, understanding who your audience is, getting it
Right.
to the right people and building up a network, because
Right.
that's what's going to really help, especially when you're at those genre festivals where you have a lot of people who are influential in the social media world talking, get with those people.
Right.
So,
Um,
I also
I mean,
thought Skin and Brick was boring, by the way.
well, I did listen. 15 grand shot in their basement of their house. I mean,
Mazel tov.
who would have mazel tov to them for hitting it big, like, but it's lightning in a bottle. Like, you don't see that every day. You see it once every so often. I mean, I didn't think Terrifier 2 was a very good movie, or Terrifier 3, but and there's many genre films that I consider way better uh, as a film, but also as a potential box office hit, and that completely tanked.
Yeah. Well, there's shock value. Curiosity drives things. I mean, you look at
Mm.
things like Winnie the Pooh, Blood and
Yeah,
Honey. I mean,
yeah.
it's certainly not going to win any Oscars, but the film struck people's curiosity. What if
Mm.
Winnie the Pooh was a killer, which is
Mm.
just outrageous, but
Yeah,
it's outrageous in the sense that you need to watch it. Sharknado, it's the same thing. I
yeah,
mean,
yeah.
obviously a different approach Sharknado took. They were,
Right,
that was, broadcast deal, et cetera. But these things, if you can capture, that curiosity and plus your genre audience, pushing it, that's what I mean. You can really break out and go find different audiences and people who, would probably never watch a genre film
right.
otherwise.
Um, I've got a few other significant topics I want to talk about. One of which is you mentioned that, back in the good old heyday where Netflix was taking films and Hulu was taking films and so on and so forth. And I know that you've had conversations with filmmakers as much as I have where that they actually think that their films are going to sell to the big boy platforms and that there's going to be a bidding war for their film for these platforms. And back in the day, sure, there would have been a great opportunity to get your film on Netflix or Hulu or Shutter. Shutter, takes films, yes, genre films. Do they pay what they used to pay? No. And not every genre film is going to get on Shutter. I mean, it's an exclusive site that they're very picky about the content that they take, and they know who their audience is and they know how to program their channel. But for filmmakers out there that are listening, indie filmmakers especially, like you can't go into this thinking that Netflix is going to take your film or Shutter's going to take your film or Hulu's going to take your film or whatever. The goal is to make the best film possible that is the most marketable film possible for the money that you have. And what I find really interesting is that since the digital age, and I'm sure you would agree with this, everybody can call themselves a filmmaker because you can go to the camera store, buy yourself a 4K camera, or you can shoot it on your iPhone and make yourself a film. But not many people actually write a proper 3-act structure film or, as you said, an episodic feature film. That they have most of those films have, and you watch them as much as I do when we're looking for content, have more holes than Swiss cheese in their execution of the film. And yet they still think, and I'm a producer, and I will tell you the hardest thing that I have with my distribution company is dealing with producers because their vision of what they think is possible for their film and what the reality vision of what can happen with their film are two different things, right?
Absolutely. I think, this goes back to kind of what I spoke about, like what I wanted to do in starting the company.
Right.
What we talk to the filmmakers before we sign on to something,
Mhm.
9 times out of 10, or we're dealing with whoever's representing the film, a sales agent on behalf of the filmmakers, and we hope that you know, they tell them what we're telling, the
But I
sales.
don't think that they do because the sales agent are the people that want way too much money all the time, right?
Normally, right? But what we try to I try my very best to be very transparent about what the business looks like, not only to keep people, to set their expectations, but also to, just to discuss things that they don't maybe understand, right? And that there are other opportunities. It's not the end all be all to be on Netflix. And
Right.
just because you're getting a message from, Joe in Arkansas who's asking when your film's going to be available on Netflix, it doesn't mean it has to go there. There's again, accessibility of platforms is so wide now. I mean,
Yeah.
wider than ever. The way you can watch a film on anything. I mean, soon they'll be projecting them into our heads. But I want to always be very clear that, this is going to be an uphill battle to get to this platform that you want, if
Right.
it's a like if it's a Hulu or if it's an HBO, and
Right.
this is why, not just hey, no, it's this is why this is hard. This is why this is difficult. We will give it the best shot, but I want you to know realistically, this is unlikely to happen and why, right? But this is what our plan is, because at the end of the day,
Mhm.
if the film doesn't make money, the distribution company doesn't make money, right? I think there's always, this kind of mentality from a filmmaker or producer side that the distributor may not be working the film as hard as they can. But that doesn't really make sense if you think about it. I mean,
Mhm.
I know there's some volume distributors out there who need, 10,000 movies a year, and they're just if each one makes a nickel, they've made a good amount of money. But companies like mine, we are very boutique and very hands-on and very white glove, and we're working with our filmmakers all the way through the process, so to have the mentality of like, we're doing something wrong
Right.
because we're not going to this platform who just isn't buying from
Right.
anyone,
Right.
is the wrong mindset, right? Like,
Right.
so we try to nip that in the bud before even getting into business with people, we want people to be hopeful, and we also are hopeful, that we could get secure a Netflix deal, secure, a Hulu deal, a Shutter deal, an
Right.
HBO deal, and we give it the best, we present the best case possible.
Right.
But we also want people to know, this is what the market looks like, and that's not the end of the road. It
Right.
keeps going. Films have become long tail,
Right.
like there is so much life in a film now. People discover films, a year, 2 years after it's come out because, of just how accessible content is, and you don't have to, wait until Jaws comes back to your local theater to see it, anymore. You can see it anywhere, and so I think it's a little bit of education, right, in terms of,
Right.
what we do, right, and I think that the more filmmakers begin to understand that and what this business looks like, the better off everyone will be, all the way from, pre-production level.
Well, and also that we can't do our job unless we get the materials that we need to do our job. Things like stills, films, things like really great poster art, where yes, we do create our own poster art sometimes, but we need elements to be able to create that poster art sometimes. A great trailer, which again, like if I don't see a great trailer when I pick up a film, then I hire Justin to cut me a trailer,
Yeah.
or I get Small Dog to redo the poster. But those elements are essential to helping have a positive experience when it comes to distribution, right?
Absolutely. I mean, the stills is the number one thing that I just don't understand
Mhm.
why there wouldn't be any still photography, or the stills that we were delivered are pictures of the craft service and people, behind the scenes, and which of course that's cute and nice and memories, it's like a
Yeah.
photo album, but
Yeah.
that has no value to what we're trying to do in terms of building assets, like it's shocking to me, and I realize people are making these things on budget, and you might not have a budget for a professional, set photographer, but you have plenty of people there, who can just snap a photo. And
Yeah.
Lord, even
Take a picture with your iPhones on
your
set.
iPhones are such high quality now that you
Right.
can have 300 DPI stills from that, so
Right.
like, there should we should never have to go into the ProRes files of a film and pull screen grabs,
But that even, but if you want to do theatrical, those screen grabs don't work on
it
a
won't
on
print.
a theatrical poster, right?
They won't print. I
No.
mean, that's it's shocking to me, that is, never thought of, and it's the same thing with like social media, right? It's like these are things that, like, I understand that my mentality is different than a filmmaker's mentality because they're creative and I'm thinking about the business. But, there has to be, that you have to be symbiotic to a certain degree, right? Like you don't your art's never going to be seen
Right.
if you are not taking all of the steps that you need to, work for a distribution company. And part of that is, stills and your socials, understing your audience, it's from an asset perspective, yeah, I just it's remarkable to me what we're delivered sometimes.
Right. Um, I want to talk now about another significant part of Dark Star Pictures business, which is physical media. And people think that physical media is dead. I can tell you, and I'm sure you will agree with me, physical media is not dead. And especially in genre, and especially in LGBTQ plus areas, that those two especially do really, really well in physical media. And maybe talk about, so, people are still making DVDs, people are making special edition Blu-rays with slip covers and things like that, or steel boxes.
We
And
do both.
yeah, yeah. So why don't you talk about, and also there's a great company called Vinegar Syndrome that is a specialty house that curates really great physical media releases, and we see people like Arrow and Kino Lorber and others that do this. Shout, talk about physical media and how it plays a part in Dark Star Pictures and in the industry.
Well, like all things with Dark Star, from the name of the company through the kinds of films we do, it's a little bit reflective of me, right? Like I think I've always been interested in physical media, whether that's for film, music. I have an extensive vinyl collection and Blu-ray collection, and I'm the guy who buys all the Criterion stuff. But it takes, from a business perspective, it takes a long time for what was a $10 billion part of the industry to go completely away, and part of our job is, as a distribution company, is to find every pocket of revenue that there is.
Yeah.
So to be dismissive of physical media is a mistake. Now, every film, doesn't necessarily warrant a physical release these days, but 90% of them do. I mean, especially with what we work with, in genre and queer content, that there are collectors. So what we've, and just to be fully transparent, the first 3 years of Dark Star, we did no physical media, mainly because it's a cost thing, right? And it was, getting the costs out there. But as the business grew and our cash flow grew, it became apparent that, we can maximize our films further by putting out physical releases, because we have audiences who will collect these things.
Right.
So we committed at that point to, building out as extensive as we can on each film. What that means is special features, things that we're going to get people excited, because the audience who are purchasing the physical content, they're people who have seen the movie already most of the time. They're coming back because they like it, they want to own it, and they want a little bit more.
Right.
So we give them a little bit more. So we're very focused on, whether that's our partnership with OCN and the Vinegar Syndrome guys, or our direct physical distribution. Anytime you see a piece of physical media coming from Darkstar, it's going to have some level of content that you have not seen in the digital landscape, separating it from, all the other places you can see it. Whether that's an uncut version of the movie, whether that's some shorts from that filmmaker that connect, and give you a better idea of their filmmaking story, commentaries. We've done behind the scene featurettes that we cut together, and this, so this kind of links back to what you were saying about what we're delivered. We're always, with our filmmakers, talking about what do you have from around the film that we can use, even if it's rough, can we edit something and put it onto a physical good? Because you'd be making a mistake to not serve the audience who wants that physical good, and they're still out there, and they're worldwide. I mean, we see our Blu-rays going all over the world. People are illegally buying them who are going to be disappointed because they're region blocked, but I'm sure they get no way around that. It's so our kind of footing in the physical media business is, partially because I love physical, but more so because there's audiences there and there's revenue there, and what's better than holding a tangible good in your hand?
Right. No, I agree. I mean, I'm a collector too. I love it. I think it separates that film from other films in the genre or whatever. And if you have lots of content to put on it, so you have a BD 25, or if you have lots of content, you'll have a BD 50, which is like a double disc kind of thing. You can, give the audience a lot more content to watch, which is what that audience wants, content, right?
Yep, absolutely.
Um, as we're coming to a close, I want to ask you one last question, which is, so here we are, 2025. Where do you see things going now for Dark Star Pictures, but also what you're seeing every time we go to the market and I see you and we briefly talk about um, the business and stuff when we're not, pounding beers. Um, what like I had to throw that in. I had to throw that. What do you like? I'm alarmed. Like I'm really alarmed. And we've been through hills and valleys for sure. This industry will always be hills and valleys. But I think since the strikes, I'm finding less content being made. The money from private investment is not what it used to be. We're not seeing the quality of films that we used to see at markets. Like we used to go to markets and see lots of opportunities to pick up really great titles. We're not seeing as many opportunities today. I'm alarmed about, and I really don't know where it's going. Do you have, you don't have a crystal ball, obviously,
Wish
but
I had the crystal ball.
yeah,
And,
yeah.
I mean, I share similar, fears
Hmm.
in the business and looking at it, from a kind of a top line level down.
Hmm.
There's certainly less quality coming out there, while seemingly more volume of films that don't work, coming there because it's easier than ever to make a film, I suppose, in terms of, like technology and things like that. But I remain optimistic because at the end of the day, you know, people need content. Audiences need to watch content they
Right.
for their own good, for their mental health, for
Hmm.
their entertainment, right? And entertainment will always be needed. It's a lot of ways I look at the music business, and what happened with the music business in the transition into all of these music streaming
Hmm.
services, and how things changed. It just led to a pivot, right? And, and
Right.
and artists need to pivot, in terms of how they produce, their content. In the cases of music, you don't see the album anymore, right? There's not the front to back. We're going to listen to this record anymore. It's single based, right? So there needed to be a pivot in that industry. It happens, and then music has never gone away, and there's still lots of independent artists. I think film in particular at this time, in particular independent film, it's at a similar crossroads. It's just a bit later than music hit it, and we're going to all of us collectively, whether that's the people on the business side like myself, or people on the filmmaking side. You're both. Um, we are going to have to collectively come together and understand what's happening and how we best approach this going forward. But what's not going to go away is the appetite from an audience to watch content, and they don't just want superhero movies and large studio pictures. People want independent content, smart content, films that will make them think. That's never going to go away. It's just a matter of how to get in front of those people, and then that's what our job is, right, as a distributor. From the filmmaker side, it's how to be smart with your budget, how to manage this, in a way that you can make the money back for the investors, so that they'll come back and do it again. I think there was a period of time where people were just, they were investing blindly into the film business because there was a lot of things. There was Redbox, there's Netflix,
Yeah.
there was the gold rush kind of that I referred to in the
Yeah.
beginning of our chat. And it's also glamorous, right? If you're an independent financier and and your movie's getting into Sundance and you get to walk down a red carpet, I mean, that's awesome, right? But I think a lot of that money is smartening up, and saying, hey, who cares about the red carpet? How do we make our money back?
Right.
So I think that there was a time where everything was a little bit careless, from the filmmaking side in terms of how money was spent, from the distribution side in terms of like what we were picking up, just because what we could sell to the platforms was so easy,
Right.
you know. So everyone's got to be a little bit smarter in terms of how we go about this, and I think there needs to be more conversations between the business side and the creative side, and there needs to be more connection between the two parties, because if you don't understand how to make money on your film, you're not
Yeah.
talking to someone about that in advance, it's going to be hard for you to make your next one because you're not going to get the money back, for the next one,
Well,
you know.
I
And
always say you're only as good as your last movie, right?
and that's it, and understanding the goals and what's realistic, and is very important, and I think more important than ever. And I mean, look, you can even see it on the studio side, right? I mean, like, obviously they still have their gigantic tent poles, etc., but there are a lot of movies that are coming out. Look at Weapons, I mean, still bigger budget than any indie, but not a big budget, a smart budget for that movie, and that movie's going to be extremely profitable. A great opening weekend, probably a really cool movie. I haven't watched it,
Hmm.
but like that, you see a lot more of that. The studios making those kind of what they consider, mid to lower budget, pieces of content. And 5 years ago, that just wasn't the case.
Right. And so, again, projecting, where things are, and is there any technology, is there any format or anything that you think might be the next AVOD kind of thing? Like, what do you think?
Well, what we've started to see more than ever is, it's not new technology. It's just an
Right.
adaptation of an existing technology, and that's YouTube.
Right.
And that's, I think it's because of the young audience.
Right.
I mean, the young audience, they use YouTube for everything. They need to change a light bulb, they go to YouTube to figure it out. Whatever.
Right.
And I think now, because YouTube is so dominant, now it's opening up into the film landscape, with people figuring out, how to properly apply ad technology to films.
Right.
YouTube's always been ad based. They're into the, linear based, they're into sports streaming, they're into live TV, all of these avenues, they're really becoming a hub where, it's going to be very beneficial for the creators, to go out, and distributors to take the creators' content out there,
Hmm.
in a way, and find your audience, in a more targeted fashion. I think as these platforms across the board develop, and you have these hubs of ad-based platforms like, Tubi, or Roku channel, or Pluto, these big guys. I think what's going to happen is you're going to find that just like how subscription VOD went, you're going to find more targeted AVOD platforms that are very specific to a certain audience, right? And that's where you really go and drive home. So people, instead of coming into the big umbrella, they're going to walk down their little hallway that is horror films,
Right.
all the AVOD for horror, instead of just having two, genre buckets on a service like Tubi. There's going to be somebody who is specialized in bringing that, horror content within the AVOD space, or queer content within the queer space, or documentary content, and I think
Right.
it's going to become a little bit more specialized, which is going to benefit everyone, because audiences will be able to find things in a specific place. There's going to be less crowding in terms
Mm.
of content out there. And, from an advertising perspective, you know exactly who you're advertising to.
Right.
So I think that's kind of the next graduation, of where things go. These more specialized, AVOD services, I think would be, the natural next movement of, consumption.
Do you think that there's a space for stores to start carrying physical media again?
I mean, do people go to stores at all? It's
I mean, and not necessarily physical stores, but the stores that used to have physical stores that are now pretty much doing everything online, where
yeah.
you don't go and try on stuff, you just have it shipped to you, and if it doesn't fit, or you look horrible in the mirror with it, you can send it back. With physical media, obviously people can buy physical media on Amazon, and there's some other platforms that you can buy it on. Obviously, Arrow and some of these other ones are selling hundreds of Criterion, especially hundreds of millions of copies of their films. Do you think that we'll see independent film on physical come out now?
So
More?
I think the answer is, I mean, it's there. The problem is that people aren't looking for it there.
Right.
Like our content exists on barnesandnoble.com and target.com and bestbuy.com and walmart.com, but the people who are going to buy things online from those places are not looking for physical media. The
Right.
glory of physical media in store was the design.
Right.
When you walk in, you see it and you're like, wow. And then you see the box art and, you peruse and you come home with a couple
Right.
DVD Blu-rays.
Right.
I think physical media, because it is more collector based, kind of driving it because it's people who are, more fans, that the direct to consumer, is really the way that is the most appealing, especially because you can promote it yourself in
Right.
the social media landscape. So that's why all those people that you mentioned, Criterion, Vinegar Syndrome, Arrow, they're all, look, I don't know their exact numbers, but I would say at least 85% of their sales come from direct
Online.
marketing.
Yeah.
Direct to consumer though, right? Their email. Like anytime I get the Criterion 50% sale for 24 hours email, I go and I buy a bunch of stuff.
Right.
And so do a lot of people. So I just think it's from a marketing perspective, it doesn't make as much sense to be pushing people to the Walmart DVD section online, because people just won't find it that way, right? Like you actually have to seek it out, whereas when you were physically in a store, it's impossible to miss.
Now that just one last thought I have is this whole idea of direct to consumer. How does maybe I shouldn't talk about this online. I should talk about this offline with you, because this whole conversation of direct to consumer is a very interesting thing, right?
Yeah.
Anyways, listen, dude, you are the man. Everybody out there, if you're filmmakers, really check out Dark Star Pictures website, see all the great content that they've acquired and that they're putting out. They put a lot of effort into every single release that they do. They're passionate. Mike and his team are super passionate about every single title they take. They do not take it lightly. They really do everything that they can possibly do to help a filmmaker and their film succeed. So take a look at Dark Star Pictures website. If you have a film and you don't want to deal with IndieCan or Redwater Pride Pictures, or maybe you want to deal with both of us or work together. But seriously, like indie filmmakers out there, like you really need to check out Dark Star. They're one of the leaders now in US distribution, North American distribution. They also do world sales as well. Check them out. Mike, thank you for coming on board. Your family, I love you very much, and thanks for taking the time to be with us on Unleashed, episode 107. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Check us out on the internet or on Spotify or Apple or Amazon, and we'll see you next time for episode 108 of Unleashed. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
We look like $1 million. Every time they look at us, we'll blow.